So could you just inform us a little bit about what does the term spiritual competency exactly mean?
It's really how do mental health professionals, I'm a clinical psychologist, but everything about this applies across the board to counselors and social workers and nurses and so on. And, we know spirituality is an important part of many of our clients' lives. And at times it's been a barrier where some underserved populations won't access conventional mental health professionals because they're not trained in how to incorporate their spirituality, which is a core strength of theirs, into their healing, the work they may need to do on a mental or a physical problem. So it's been this barrier, and there's been times where psychology has really been has pathologized or certainly ignored religion. My training included nothing about it. So there was this gap, and I became aware of it, particularly in regard to the area of spiritual crisis, because of some lived experience that I had. But as I got more and more into that work, it culminated in acceptance of the DSM-IV definition for religious or spiritual problems. And that was to really acknowledge the role of spiritual crises as to distinguish them from psychotic disorders and so on, which had been my goal. But as I, worked in the mental health field, I got asked to do workshops on religious and spiritual problems, for example. And spiritual crisis is only one type of a religious or spiritual problem. Another type is the experience of loss of faith in one's life for somebody whose religion may have been very important, and then they have an experience where they lose that faith. And there are anomalous experiences people have that also might throw them off and create a problem in their life that they would consult a therapist about. So it's a very broad area of religious or spiritual problem. So I began to see, to incorporate issues of grief. How do you work with dying patients, and so on. So the whole area broadened, and I began to see that there was a pretty wide range of competencies that psychologists should acquire in order to address religious and spiritual problems. And another aspect of that is that there are times people have, the reason that it's not, I broadened from religious and spiritual problems to spiritual competency is because there's also times where a person doesn't have a problem with it. It's an asset, a strength in their life. And if you're working with them on something else, you can harness that strength of theirs into the work. But you have to understand something about it and its role as a positive coping strategy, and how to connect with the client around this, how to build a therapeutic alliance around this. How do you show respect and appreciation, which is foundational to doing all the things I was just talking about. And therapists aren't trained in that.
Could you give us some examples of the different spiritual competencies?
We took several years to develop this concept and conducted several studies to develop this concept. If you talk about competencies, there are knowledge, skills, and these attitudes and values. So I took a step of saying, well, then in that case, what would be the attitudes and values? Okay, so one of the values would clearly be showing respect. So that is one. And I generated, knowledge of different the major world's religious traditions, a whole bunch of factors, skills, being able to conduct a spiritual assessment with a client. Which is foundational to we're doing work in any of these areas. Okay, so I came up with a personal opinion about this. Then somebody who was a former student of mine, Cassie Wheaton, who's the president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, took this and put together a team of researchers, and we did a 4-stage study to validate these. So we started with my list and convened a focus group of people who had a very strong background, publications, and training in mindfulness and meditation teachers, and a wide range of people with different kinds of expertise to spend a day together with us. After we had actually, I didn't mention that, done an extensive lit review. So we brought this focus group together, we refined it, then we created a survey from the best product that we experts could do with the literature, blah, 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 decades, hundreds of years of experience. We then brought it to a much wider range, 189, I believe, psychologists who had some expertise in religion and spirituality. Unlike many psychologists who are atheists or agnostics, these were psychologists who had some interest in religion and spirituality. So we validated this validating meaning, we reduced it from like 24 to like ultimately 16. It was a refining process.
Okay.
Then we wanted to get a more general sample of psychologists. So what we did is we rented a booth at the American Psychological Association and had a giveaway of 5 iPads for filling out a survey. So we were getting a much, much wider range. They had no interest in religious spirituality, but the questions did, but they didn't necessarily. And we got, we looked at their attitudes about what are the core competencies and so on. So then based on that, we published 2 articles in peer-reviewed journals with these criteria. So that they have a lot of validity. Cassie Beaton and Shelley Scammell, who were key researchers in this process, published a book on religious and spiritual competencies.
There's still the stigma here in Brazil, and I think in other parts of the U.S., and that maybe outside San Francisco, that if you're sort of interested in spiritual topics, that you're not particularly scientific or scientifically rigorous. And it sounds like, you and your team have done a very rigorous job of getting these competencies down with lots of research, based on opinions of people, especially psychologists in the field.
Yeah. But we were kind of synthesizers. Our research was to validate the competencies. The competencies are based on, hundreds and hundreds of research studies showing why these things are critical for a competent mental health professional.
And so you started this work in the late 80s, early 90s? When did it start?
Well, I would say it started after the DSM category. With the DSM category, I got asked to, do workshops at all kinds of places because I would also publish on spiritual crises and so on.
Yeah. And when did the DSM category get recognized? What year was that?
That was 1994.
1994. Okay.
Right. So that's the beginning of my starting to look more broadly.
Okay. And so in the beginning, how was this work received by the mainstream? Who were you bringing it to? Who were you introducing it to? And how was it, at least initially, for you?
Yeah, here, spirituality is part of mainstream treatment at Kaiser's and county mental health departments. I've been involved in what's called a mental health and spirituality initiative, where we have somebody in each county. There are 58 counties in California. Is a mental health and spirituality liaison, somebody who knows the religious and spiritual resources in their county and can help their patients access them, and even bring in some of these outside groups and help them as a mental health professional, bring in religious and spiritual groups to help, meet clients' spiritual needs.
Oh, okay. So
this has resulted in some funding, for example, in some of the counties which have Native American populations. There's a kind of, going back to their ancestral ritual, sweat lodges and stuff like that. Specifically, and learning what's called the medicine wheel, specifically as a way to cut down on addictions and substance. And that there are some research articles showing that does work with that population. The sweat lodge is conducted in a very ceremonial, set way. There's not that much variation. It's always 4 quarters, and certain prayers are said, and so on. So it's a very structured approach.
But at the same time, you're saying that the mental health departments in the government in California is funding sweat lodges, correct?
Yep. If you trace it back, that's absolutely true. Yep.
They weren't doing that in '94, though, were they? It wasn't that developed back then.
No. I think there has been a shift in attitudes about this, and spirituality is seen as a strength.
And is there ever an issue of spirituality or spiritual practices replacing psychiatry or psychiatric medications, or is there tension there, or is there cooperation?
I think what we're looking at now is an era of integrative health approaches. It would mean collaboration rather than competition. And many people have both mental health / psychiatric needs and spiritual needs. So I've collaborated with a chaplain at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, and we led a group called Finding Your Higher Power. And we had many patients who were in 12-step programs, but many of them were really struggling to find that sense of connection to a higher power. And I led a group once with a rabbi that we explored patients' religious or spiritual delusions and hallucinations. They were totally invited to talk about what they had experienced in this domain. I actually held these groups off the unit together with the rabbi, and a lot came out about their experiences of having visions that they'd never been able to share, about who they were, that, they wanted to be the starting point of a conversation, but if you got through that, there was a real person there that you could relate to. So these groups really liberated a lot of energy, interpersonal energy. The staff noticed that when these patients came back on the unit, they were talking with each other, they were talking with the staff, and that had not been happening before.
And also, you mentioned that word integrative. The caption for our conference is an integral vision. It's the idea of what happens to these people who are currently, in silos, in the psychiatric silo, the psychology silo, shamanic silo, or spiritual silo, the peer support silo. What happens if you get them talking to each other, finding out where the common ground is, what works in what situation?
I like to be able to share these examples because it shows what's possible. It is not the mainstream. And
okay.
And most of mental health treatment is cognitive behavioral and medication. But, we've been able to, as part of this initiative, and there really is an initiative, a group of consumers and some religious professionals. We have a few ministers of various kinds, many of whom are also mental health professionals like social workers and so on. So we've had a very mixed, diverse group that has, we met to create this initiative. We got some funding from the counties to do it. And then we've held also conferences where we brought people together. We've held 3 conferences where we've had about the third of the group is consumers, a third of the group are mental health professionals, and a third of them are religious professionals. And so it really allows for a lot of dialogue.
Do you have any advice or experience in how to sort of break down those barriers between yourself, your work, the integral vision, and the current mainstream model of cognitive therapy and meds?
Well, I think it's the way a movement like this will succeed is through, I think, a lot of people like you who really have the savvy to get this into various different kinds of media. And that's a really key way to get things out. I published about 80 articles in journals and stuff. Those don't get to see much light of day compared to somebody like your bipolar awakening videos that I think have really had an impact on people's understanding very widely. So, I think that kind of thing, and then, doing the academic stuff that I like to do really helps. And I have a couple of research articles on spirituality as a self-identified consumer need. 80% of consumers say yes, they do want spirituality incorporated into it.
80%. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's based on surveys we've conducted. And so as more and more, sort of that whole thing about paradigms, change one funeral at a time. I don't think that's in the scientific world. People who believe in older paradigm in physics, they never stop reading, including Einstein. He hated quantum physics. He thought that was just total nonsense.
So there's going to be a cultural movement, and then as the culture moves, then they'll be more receptive to these ideas.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add?
Everything is kind of a work in progress. So if any of the people watching have any access, any clout to implement things, to just go ahead and start doing that, and be part of this movement to be more spiritually inclusive.